I'm going to show you the game between Peter Svidler and Georg Meier from round 3 of the Grenke Chess Classic. Remember, if you want to subscribe to the channel, then do click on the button below. And if you want to support the channel, then do check out the links to PayPal and Patreon.com in the video description. Right, on with this game. So Peter Svidler with white. Now, what an experienced player. 42 years old, achieved so much in his chess career. I think I just need to say that he is 8-time Russian champion, and that says it all. That is an extraordinary record. Now he's playing Georg Meier, a younger player, 31 years old, rated a fair bit below, but also he's pretty experienced, and well, he's playing his favourite French defence. And yeah, he has a very good record with this. Very experienced, very knowledgeable. And he goes for the classical. Sometimes he simply takes on e4 here. He's very knowledgeable about that variation, but he goes for the classical instead. And Svidler, I think, well, I think psychologically he makes a good move here, because instead of playing bishop g5 and allowing pawn takes pawn, instead he closes the position down with e5. Of course, this is one of the main lines. So we have a closed position instead of allowing those exchanges in the middle of the board. Of course, it's one of the main lines of the classical. And here black has an enormous choice. Bishop e7. You can play a6 and b5. You can take on c4, on d4. Meier takes on d4 and plays queen b6, which looks really hazardous. In fact, this is a very forcing line, because really it's tricky for white to defend this pawn and guard against, for example, threats here on this diagonal. So white has to play queen d2. And then the only way to justify this move is to capture on b2. Forces this, and bishop b5. Now this is a highly theoretical position. So, both sides will know this position extremely well. Curious enough, there was another game in exactly the same round in Grenke that went exactly like this, Aronian against Vallejo. So bishop b5 and takes on d4. And now here the game Aronian Vallejo played a6, which is went a6, which is a little bit more common. That game finally ended in a draw. But Meier very quickly played bishop b4. And it's also been seen before. In fact, Meier has played this before. And here Svidler thought for 15 minutes. I mean, I'm slightly surprised about that. The main move played here is castles. And Meier has, as I said, played that against that previously and drawn. But Svidler today went for rook b3, which also is pretty reasonable. Queen came back and a3. Meier seemed to know this position very well, was moving very quickly still with black. And now here, yeah, Meier puts the bishop back on e7. You could take, but of course, in these kind of positions where this dark squared bishop has no opponent, once it reaches this diagonal, then it's clear that white has excellent compensation, and you can see that rook is in the perfect position to swing across under the right circumstances to the king side. So back to this position, bishop e7. Now if black manages to consolidate here, get castled, and this knight castles and the knight comes to c5, then well, he could just be a pawn up for nothing. Remember, black has this typical French pawn structure. This is the spine of black's position. This is holding black's position together. And if white can't break through, then black could just be a pawn up with a very nice structure. So that's why Svidler pushes on with the f-pawn, trying to break up this structure. You know, there's potential to play f6 here, and that could lead to complete destruction of black's king on this side of the board, for example. So it's necessary for Meier to take this. Well, he did this very quickly. Obviously has analysed this variation. Knight takes pawn. Hübner once played bishop h4 check here and got mangled very quickly by Nick de Fermian. Let me just show you that very quickly. Knight f6 check, and this was absolutely horrible. Black's king is just in massive trouble here. There's a potential check and a queen h6 and all kinds of things. So in this position, well, again, Meier knew exactly what was going on here, and he exchanged queens. Knight c7 threatened, so bishop d8. So Svidler has managed to break up this strong pawn chain, and he's got his knight in this fantastic central square d5. Very strong, and black's development, of course, is very poor. You know, this horrible pin here, bishop's on the back ranks, the rook's still in the corners, but black is a pawn up. And if black can emerge from this position, then his structure will actually be very nice. You can see he has two clumps of pawns, one on the king side and 4 pawns, two on the queen side, 4 on the king side. White's pawns are very poor, and he has 1 less than black. So this is the challenge. Can Meier somehow escape from these sort of temporary difficulties, these pins and white's activity? Now here c4 has been played before, which supports the knight in the middle. It's not bad, and starts to cramp black on the queen side. But Svidler here had a really big think. He thought for over 22 minutes and played rook c3. And that was Meier's cue to think for a very long time. He thought for 46 minutes over his next move. In fact, this position has been reached before, and black played a6, which actually worked out pretty well, driving the bishop away. But bishop a5 played instead by Meier. So there's a pin there, so that really forces knight c7 check, which in turn forces this exchange. And black's king can't escape to the king side because obviously the knight could be taken. So Meier plays the king to the middle, attacking the rook, which has to go back, which looks a bit perilous with black's king in the middle. However, after knight f8, you can see that black's pieces do start to emerge, and potentially, yeah, one of these pieces has a nice position on e6. Nevertheless, white has compensation for the pawn here, no doubt about it. Rook d3 is possible with this idea. Rook number 2 comes into play, reasonable compensation. But instead Svidler went bishop c5, which is also reasonable. And after this move he took on f8. Of course, if rook takes, then we've got rook d3 pinning and winning. Therefore bishop takes bishop, and now bishop takes pawn. So what's the score now after this check? In fact, pawns are now level, but black has some freedom here. This bishop has emerged. This rook is on this semi-open file down to the g file. This rook can potentially come into the game. Maybe the king is wandering up the board to e6. On the surface of things, it feels as though Meier has escaped from his difficulties here. Well, let's see what happened. Rook d1. So this is tricky. So it's very tempting for black to take this pawn with check. Let's see what happens if rook takes pawn. I should say that Meier did not do this. Well, why not? Well, white meets this check with another check. The king comes up the board, checking the king. Now, unfortunately, king e6 is inadvisable because of checkmate. So the king would have to go back. Then white's rook could enter on the 7th rank. Bishop c6 locks in the rook somehow. But then e6 is still quite dangerous. Giving up that pawn, the rook sweeps and takes that pawn. So what's the score? Black is a pawn up. I mean, it's not really very relevant here. White is still very active. You can see that king trapped on the back rank. I can kind of understand why Meier was reluctant to go in for this position, because it could be that, you know, after a couple more moves, maybe a rook d6 or something, that somehow white manages to break through with rook number 2. This is still a very tricky position. You know, if the rook has to come back to defend, it starts to look a bit ugly. So instead Meier played f4, which actually gives black's king some room here. And if king c1 check, then the king steps up, and you can see that the king now has a square on f5. So this looks healthy. Remember, and black isn't quite there, but once that bishop hits c6, that just kind of binds black's position together and takes away a lot of useful squares from white's rooks. But Svidler played a tricky move now. He played g3. And here Meier went wrong. He took the pawn. He took the bait. But the safest move is to play king e6. Just getting that king out of trouble. And if rook f3, I mean, black has to be very careful here. Remember, if pawn takes pawn, then the king steps up and rook d6 mate is the threat. Very difficult to avoid that. You have to give up a rook. But actually black plays rook g4, and after pawn takes pawn, for example, then the king can step into f5, and that's actually relatively safe. Now white is better here, but I think black has pretty reasonable drawing chances in that position. But it's still tricky. It's still tricky. So I think king e6 the best move there, but instead pawn takes pawn played, and this was unpleasant because after king c1, that's check. The king cannot step up to e6 because rook f3 takes away the escape square, and then rook d6 mate threatened, and that's fatal. So after king c1, the king had to step back. Now this is nasty, dare I say it. Black's rooks are split. You know, for me, that's a big danger sign, and it's very much the case here. Pawn takes pawn. The rooks are split. This one is not coming out. If only these rooks could join together somewhere, but no. Bishop c6, that blocks this rook from coming down here, but rook d4. Problem is that white can attack from both sides. This side, but also this side on the h-file. This rook is dreaming of freedom. Rook d3, threatening mate. King steps this way. But of course not rook d8 check, no. These rooks working perfectly together. What a contrast with these. Threat, rook takes pawn, so h6, and the pawn marches to g4, and the threat is to play g5 just to prise open the Rooks file, and then it'll be fatal. Let's see what happens. So bishop b5. This is very clever. If the rook comes to h3, then the king might be able to step out. So instead, Svidler just nudged back with rook d2. So that means that this king is never going to escape here because the rook still controls the d file. The rook came to e8. g5, great move. So if pawn takes pawn, well, it'll be something rather similar to the game. White's rook will invade, followed by rook number 2. Well, we can see that very quickly here. Check. And it's going to be mate very soon on the h file. You can see that king simply can't step up in order to connect the rooks. So after g5, rook takes pawn. It's absolutely the same here. The rook came back to g8, and now rook takes h2, rook d to h2. And that was the final move of the game. Meier resigned. There is no decent defense to rook h8, exchanging, and then rook h8. Let me just play a few dumb moves from black and put it on the board. There we are. That is what's going to happen. So that was rook h2, final move of the game. And well, there you go. I'm coming back to one of my favorite themes, split rooks. You can see what a difference. They aren't working together, but in combination, rooks are so powerful, particularly when supported by that bishop. This is almost the equivalent of an octopus knight. This is like a, well, not quite an octopus bishop. Maybe this is a stingray bishop, controlling those squares and just killing those rooks completely. So a very fine game by Peter Svidler, who somehow in a position which felt as though black was escaping, he managed just to keep enough complications and finally confuse Georg Meier. And I think Peter won a really nice game there. So after that victory, Peter Svidler is now in joint first place with Magnus Carlsen. Magnus only drew today against Viswanathan Anand. Vishy put up a superb defence. Carlsen missed his chances, but Vishy really dug deep to draw that game. So Svidler and Carlsen in the lead with 2.5. In second position, Anand and Caruana. Caruana beat Vincent Keimer, who's having a rough time. In the next round, in round 4, we're going to see, of course, Caruana against Carlsen. Can't wait for that. See you then.